Mesechus Yevamos Daf Tzadihei contains two distinct sugyas. One is the sugya of a man who does a bia with his wife's relative. Does his wife become usher to him? The Gemara will compare and contrast two such cases. That is, a bia with one's wife's sister and one's wife's mother. Both of those are usher. Do they usher the wife? The Gemara will have machlokas b'sol beishamai. Machlokas what the b'sol beishamai is, and a number of potential sources as to what that halacha should be. Then the Gemara will go to its second sugya, which is a cryptic statement of Rabbi Yossi in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yossi will argue on the Tanakam. We're going to try to figure out what he said. We'll have three pshatim in what he said, and then we'll discuss the halacha l'maisa. So let's begin. The Gemara has just said that if a man does bia with his wife's sister, doesn't aser his wife. Even though the bia was aser, doesn't aser his wife, even though he did a bias iser. The Gemara says, what is the source for that? So the Gemara says, you may have had a kavachomer to say that it should aser. It should aser his wife. And the kavachomer is that in this case, the man is the oiser. The man is asering his wife to anyone else. And we know that if somebody is to do an iser kal, it asers the oiser. So here, with this is an iser chamor, it should aser the oiser. It should aser the husband, who is the source of his wife's iser, to everyone else. Now, this is a brisa that brings us kavachomer. The Gemara is going to explain it much later at the end of the sugya what this kavachomer is exactly. But the brisa says that there is a pasuk that gives a source that there is no iser. It says osa when it's describing the iser of a woman who is mizana on her husband. Has b'shachav ish osa shechvazar v'nelame eine isha. If a man lies with a woman, with her, it's referring to the sugya of a sota. So that asers her on her husband. That shows only this case asers her on her husband, not something else. And that's if there's a bia of an achos ishto, does not aser a woman on her husband just because her husband was together with her sister. Now the Gemara says there's a further discussion here in a brisa which compares achos ishto and chavoso. Achos ishto is of course his wife's sister who's aser. Chamoso is his wife's mother. And the Gemara says is that the brisa says there's a machlokas b'sol beishamai in one of these two cases, and there's a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda in which case. So according to Rabbi Yehuda, well, let's first say that everyone agrees that chamoso is more likely to passel his wife. A bia with chamoso is more with his wife's mother is more likely to passel his wife than a bia with his wife's sister. According to Rabbi Yehuda, chamoso everyone agrees passels his wife, and the machlokas is in the case of the sister. Does that passel or not? Beis Shammai says it passels the sister, Misil says it does not. According to Rav Yossi, no. Achoso, like we said, is lighter. Everyone agrees does not passel. Achos ishto doesn't passel. The machlokas is in the case of chamoso, one's wife's mother's bia, does that passel or not? And there, again, Beis Shammai says it passels, and Misil says it does not passel. So now the Gemara is going to go through Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Why do each one have such a confident source in their own case that there's no machlokas? So first, the Gemara discusses the opinion of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi is the one who said that in the case of achos ishto, there's definitely no psol. What's the source for that? So the Gemara says you have separate sources for a bias achos ishto b'mezid and a bias achos ishto b'shogeg. Bias achos ishto b'mezid is like we said before. The pasuk says v'shachav ish osa. The yisr on the between husband and the wife is only created when the woman is mezana, not created when there's an isr achos ishto that was performed. By shogeg we have a kavachomer, and we don't have to come on to the pasuk. What's the kavachomer? So we will compare the isser created on him and the isser created on her. When a man and woman got married, they each created an isser on each other. She becomes usher on every other man in the world. He becomes usher, not on every woman in the world, because a man's allowed to have two wives. He becomes usher on all of her relatives. So the isser on her is greater than the isser on him. So therefore it should be more chamer. Now, the isser on her, were she to violate b'shogeg, that is, if she hears by two Adam that her husband died and she goes and marries someone else, so she violated the isser on her, the isser eshes ish, she violates that b'shogeg, does not aser on her husband. She's still allowed to go back to him because it was a shogeg. Therefore, an isser achos isha, one's wife's sister, which, if that's performed by two witnesses who told him that his wife died and he's now married to her sister, that also should not aser him on her, should not aser the two of them from each other, kal v'chomer. Okay, so that's how you know b'shogeg. B'mezid, we said we have the source. This is all Rabbi Yosef's opinion, who says Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel would never argue about this. Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel are arguing in the case of chamosa. So now the Gemara says, what's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion? How does he know that there's definitely no machlokes in the case of chamoso? So the Gemara says Rabbi Yehuda has a simple drasha. The Torah says, and we've discussed this on the last daf, the Torah says, discussing the punishment for somebody who has bia with his chamoso, it says, V'sarfu ba'esh oso v'asan, you burn him and them female. So that sounds like you're burning his wife and his mother-in-law. The question is, his wife didn't do anything wrong. She was married first, she was married beheter, what's the problem? So obviously, says Rabbi Yehuda, it's not talking about sreifa. When it says esen, it's talking about iser. There's no sreifa on her as a result, but there is an iser created on both of them as a result of his bias chamoso. And therefore both chamoso and ishto are now asr on him. That's the esen, that's the sreifas esen, means that they're both asr to him now. And there's a clear source, therefore, that one has to be with chamoso, his wife is asr to him, and that's why Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai don't argue in that case. Now what's the halacha here? So there's a statement of Amiroim. We have Rav Yehuda, the Amira, not to be confused with Rabbi Yehuda, the Tana, who we've been discussing up to now. Rav Yehuda, the Amira, says the name of Shmuel. The halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore it is not clear that chamoso is aser. It's a machlokes Beis Hillel Beis Shammai, or pasuk like Beis Hillel that it's mutter. So the Gemara says it was an incident that happened with a man who did an issa with chamoso. He came before Rav Yehuda, he gave him malchus, and he said, if not for the fact that Shmuel said that the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, I would have asked you to your wife. So you're lucky I'm not asking you to your wife at all. The Gemara now tries to establish what is the kavachomer that the Brisa was referring to all the way back in the beginning. We said we had a kavachomer which should show that a bias achos ishto creates an iser on the wife. We said it's not true because of the pasuk, but we had that kavachomer. So what was the kavachomer referring to? We said an iser kal and iser chomer, asering the iser. What are we talking about? So we're looking for is the following thing. We're looking for a case where there is an iser. That iser is violated, and the violation of the iser makes that the iser, that is the source of that iser, now itself becomes aser. So, for example, in the case of achos ishto, that works as follows. A man is aser to have a beer with his achos ishto. If he violates that iser, then he who is the source, if that iser is violated, he who is the source of the iser becomes aser himself. And that would be that he is now aser on his wife. You could view that as the wife is the source of the Isser, and that's how the Gemara is going to set up the Kavachomer. When a man is married to a woman, she asers him on her sister. If that Isser is violated, she now becomes aser to him herself. She created an Isser on her husband to her sister. That Isser is violated. Now she herself is aser to her husband. The Isser becomes aser. So what we need is a case of an Isser kal, which is a light Isser, because that's what the Gemara said. We need an Isser kal to use as a kal v'chomer, where the Isser kal does this. It asers the Isser. Violating an Isser kal asers the Isser. And therefore we're going to learn from there to achos ishto, we're violating the Isser kal asers the Isser. So where is this Isser kal which asers the Isser? So the Gemara is going to try 6 attempts to find this. So the Gemara's first attempt is that we are talking about machzor gushaso. That is, if somebody divorces his wife and she goes and she marries somebody else, that man is now an Isser. He asks her to go back to her original husband. If she goes back to her original husband, she's now asked her to go to the second husband who she just left. She can't go back to him. Because the second husband was the Isser, asked her on her original husband, created a situation where even if he divorced her, she can't go back to her original husband. If she violated that Isser, she went back to her original husband. Even with a get, she can't go back to her second husband, who was the Isser. So here you have, it's an Isser kal, because it's machzor geshasi is only a lav, but it asers the Isser. So the Gemara says you cannot learn a kavachem from here to achos ishto, for the simple reason that there's 2 pirchos, there's 2 ways in which this is more chamer. First of all, this is an Isser olam. It exists even after the death of whoever is involved. The Isser machzor geshasu exists even after the second husband dies. But achos ishto only exists during the lifetime of the Osir, during the lifetime of the wife. If she dies, then her sister is permitted. And the second thing is that this was a bia in the woman herself. that the wife who was involved, the one who was usher, the bia, she's the one who did a bia, so she was usher to the usher. Then she herself, who was usher, did a bia, and then she became usher. However, in the case of the achos isha, it's not what we're looking for. There we have that the bia of the sister ushers the wife. That's a different person. There's no bia there. How would you see that the bia of the husband in the achos ishto should usher the ishto? That's a step further along where you don't see that over here. So the Gemara says, let's try a different attempt. The Gemara says maybe it's talking about yibum. So the Gemara says, which yibum? What yibum? What's the case of yibum? So the Gemara has two versions. First yibum is yivam l'shuk. That's you have a person who has yibum. Woman falls to yibum. She's usher to the shuk. The iser, the one who's creating the iser here, is the yavam, the brother who she's supposed to do yibum to. If she goes, violates the iser, and she does an iser, yavam l'shuk, according to Rav Hamnuna, she's now usher on her yavam. So there you have that the iser, by violating the iser, becomes usher, and it's an iser kal, because yavam l'shuk is only a lav. So we're in Rav Hamnuna's opinion, this would work out. So the Gemara says the problem with this is, first of all, again, the bia was in the woman herself. The iser was violated in her herself, and she becomes also to the yavam. You cannot learn from there tachos ishto where the bia sister was in the sister. And the other thing is that this is an iser roiv. This yavama was also to the entire world. That's in a way a sense more chomer than the iser achos ishto, where it was only aser to the sister. The Isser that was created by the wife is only an Isser on her sister. Here, the Isser that's created by the Yavam is an Isser on the entire world. This Yavama is also l'shuk to everybody. So that's more Chamer than, so you can't learn it to there. So the Gemara says, okay, maybe we'll go to the case of the brothers. What's it talking about? In Isser that was created, if one of the brothers does Maimer. Maimer is a Kedushin. It has a validity d'Rabbanan. If a Yavam does Kedushin to his Yavama, it creates a connection with d'Rabbanan that answers her on all the other brothers. So now this Yavam, the Baal Maimer, who did Maimer, he asered the Yevama to all the other brothers. If one of them goes and does bia with her, that asers her on the Baal Maimer. Asers her on the one who created the original Isser. So he's the Isser, and he becomes aser because of the bia that happened with one of the other brothers. So there's a number of kashas you could ask here. The Gemara chooses to ask is, why are you saying if one of the other brothers does bia, it asers? Let's say one of the other brothers does maimer, that also asers. If first maimer created an iser, second maimer, now she has maimer to two brothers, each one is achos mamaro, each one is the balas maimer of his brother, that is, then they're both aser to each of them. So just say the second brother did maimer, why do you have to talk about whether the second one did bia? That would not be what the Brisa was referring to. So Gemara says, no, maybe the Brisa is Rabban Gamliel, who holds that a second Maimer doesn't count as anything after the first Maimer. It's Dvarim B'Telim. So Gemara says, okay, there's still another way. If the second brother went and gave her a get, or did Chalitza, that would ask her on the Baal HaMaimer. So again, the Brisa can't be referring to that case, because that's what it would have said. It wouldn't have to talk about a bia. Gemara says, okay, forget ye. So then it's not Yevama, so maybe it's talking about Sota. The Isser on a Sota. The Gemara says, which Isser on a Sota? Sota is also the Baal, also the Boel. Once a woman becomes a Sota, she was warned not to be secluded with a man. She did it anyway. Now she has an obligation to drink the Sota water. She's also the Baal, also the Boel, until she drinks the Sota water. So which Isser are we referring to? So the Gemara says, maybe it's talking about where she did bia to the Baal. The Baal, her husband, is the one who created an Isser on the Boel. So if she did bia to the Baal, so that's violating the Isser on the Baal. The Baal himself is also Isser. It's violating the Isser on the Baal. Then the Baal himself becomes Isser because of the Isser that was created. So the Baal becomes Isser. The Baal was already Isser. The Baal was Aser to the Sota already before, even if he didn't do any bia, even until he does either, even if he gives her a get, until she drinks the Sota water and is cleared, he's Aser. So this is not something that's created. The Aser doesn't become Aser because of this bia that happened there. So the Gemara says maybe talking about the Boel, that there's an Isser LeBoel, and that's violated. she does bia to the boel, that's violated. So the Gemara says, and that creates an isser. So the Gemara says that can't be, because the isser on the boel is not an isser kal. Isser on the boel is an isser chomer. It's an isser. That's an isser ashes ish, what she did, because she's married to her husband. So that wouldn't be an isser kal. It's not any more kal than achos ishto. So the Gemara therefore goes to its final pshat, and the Gemara says it's talking about the isser ashes ish. It's a woman violated an isser ashes ish. The oser is her husband. Her husband asers her and everybody else. By violating the isser ashes ish, she becomes aser to her husband. So the isser that is performed asers the iser. Now, why is it called an isser kal? So it's not really kal, it's not a lav, but it is in a sense more kal than achos ishto, because achos ishto can never end in the lifetime of the wife. Achos ishto, the oser is the wife. The wife asers her sister by her marriage to her husband. As long as she's alive, there's no way to take this isser off. After she dies, it goes off, but as long as she's alive, this isser doesn't come off. In the case of Eshes Ishto, the Isser could come off. A husband could give a get, and then the Isser that he created ends. Therefore, it's lighter than Achos Ishto. And if it creates an Isser on the Osir when it's violated, then Achos Ishto should also create an Isser on the Osir when it's violated. Therefore, you would have a Kavach Chomer to say that when a man has beer with his Achos Ishto, it asers his Ishto. She is the Osir. That's why we need the pasuk to tell me that it's not correct. The Gemara quotes a Brisa, which spells out this was a Kavach Chomer all along, and that's the Limud, just as we had assumed. Alright, now the Gemara wants to refer back to the Mishnah where we had a statement of Rabbi Yossi, and the Gemara wants to understand what did Rabbi Yossi mean. What was it that Rabbi Yossi had said? So the Tanakama had said that if a man's wife goes to Medina Siyam, he hears that she dies, and then he goes based on that and marries her sister, but then she comes back. So he's not asur on his wife. And on that, Rabbi Yossi said, anytime there's an isser created on others, it asers for him, and anytime there's no Isser created on others, it doesn't asr for him. So what does that mean? What's talking about? Who's the others? How do others create an Isser for him? What's going on? So the Gemara says the case is clearly talking about one thing. The question is how to work it out. It's clearly referring to where his wife's sister was married. And the Isser that's created refers to, is that sister now asr on her husband? So let's get the names down here. We have the man, we have his wife, we have her sister, who we'll just call the sister, and then we have the sister's husband, who we'll call the brother-in-law. So you have the wife and the brother-in-law went to Medina Sayyam. The report comes back that they both died, and therefore the husband marries the sister. Now, you need the wife to be dead in order to that be permitted, otherwise he's an Isser Achos Ishto. You also need the brother-in-law to be dead, otherwise she's an Eshes Ish. So we heard that both of them died. Then they both come back. The wife comes back and the brother-in-law comes back. Now they both have a problem. So the Tanakama had said that the halacha is that we don't care what happens with the brother-in-law. The brother-in-law asers his wife. He's now asr on his wife. His wife was an Eshes Ish. She married someone else. She married the husband in this case. And therefore she's asr on the brother-in-law who's her husband. Even though that Ish is created, the Tanakama says that has no bearing on whether the husband here is asr on his wife. Even though this exact marriage of the husband to the sister of the wife that created an isser on the sister to the brother-in-law is not going to create an isser on the wife to the husband, because this is only an isser ashes. This is only an isser achosisha, and there's no isser on the wife because of a violation of achosisha. That's Tanakama's opinion. On that, Rabbi Yossi says no. If it creates an isser on others, meaning the brother-in-law, it creates an isser on him too. If it creates no isser on the brother-in-law, it does not create an isser on him. So the Gemara says, hold on a second, let's analyze this over here bit by bit. Which halacha is Rav Yossi coming to tell me? He's coming to tell me that just like the brother-in-law, in this case here, is mutter, is he trying to tell me that the brother-in-law is mutter in his wife? It means to say as follows. He means to say, the Tanakama told me that the brother-in-law is usher, and the wife, that the sister is also to the brother-in-law, but the wife is also to the husband. So I'm telling you that you can't split those two halachos, says Rabbi Yossi. Therefore, just like the husband is also to the wife, the sister is mutter. Just like the husband is mutter to his wife, the sister is mutter to the brother-in-law. So when it says if that's true, so then the Mishnah sets it up backwards. It shouldn't say anytime the other is mutter to his wife, the husband is mutter to his wife. That's not correct. It goes the other way around. It's anytime the husband is mutter to the wife, the sister is mutter to the brother-in-law. It's caused the other way. The heter comes from the husband to the wife, and by extension goes to the brother-in-law and the sister. So that's backwards. So it must be saying the isser then. It's being mechadish, and it's saying that just like in the case, just like the brother-in-law is usher to the sister, so the husband is usher on the wife. That's what Rebbe means to say. It means to say, you thought that there's a split between the two. No, because the brother-in-law is usher on the sister, the wife is usher on the husband as well. So the Gemara says the problem with that is that only deals with half of what he said. That deals with what he said when he said that when others are usher, you're usher, but he himself is usher. But what is it referring to when it says when others are mutter, he's mutter? What's that talking about? So Gemara says, I'll explain what it's talking about. There is a situation in which the sister is mutter to her husband, and that's if she was nisis al pi shnayim edim. She had two witnesses who came and testified that her husband died, therefore she's mutter. In that case, the chiddush of Rabbi Yossi is just like she, the sister, is mutter on her husband, she's also mutter on the, just like she's mutter on her husband, who's the brother-in-law, she's also mutter on the original husband, in this case, who is married to the sister's, who's married to the wife, his wife, who is the sister of who we're calling the sister. So that's how the Gemara wants to explain what Rabbi Yossi's intent is. The Tana Kama had been trying to say that it makes no difference whether it's one aid or two aidim. The difference between one aid and two aidim only applies as far as the sister to her husband. It only applies as far as the Isser Ishes Ish. It makes no difference in the Isser Achos Ishto. Isser Achos Ishto is mutter either way. And on that, Rabbi Yossi says, no, it depends. If the Ishes Ish is mutter, then the Achos Ishto is mutter. If the Ishes Ish is Aser, that's the sister to the brother-in-law, then the Achos Ishto is also going to be Aser. So that's the Gemara's first attempt to explain Rabbi Yossi. The Gemara keeps this. The Gemara says that Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha has another explanation where we don't have to get involved in bringing in where there was two aidim or one aid. That's all not in this Mishnah really, that's all in the previous Mishnah. So what we're really doing is saying that this Tana Kama is referring back to the previous Mishnah, and Rabbi Yossi is commenting on that, not so lechatchila. So he says you can keep it all within this Mishnah and work it out. How so? So the Gemara quotes Rav Yitzchak Nafcha, and Rav Yitzchak Nafcha pulls the switch in what is the reason that an Ashes Ish is usher when her husband comes back. It's a shogeg. What she did was b'shogeg either way, so why should she be usher? So up to now we've been assuming it was a knas midrabanan. Rav Yitzchak Nafcha says it's not a knas midrabanan. The problem is that people are not going to realize that she's not married to the second man. People are going to think that she was divorced from her first husband. She was therefore legally married to the second husband. If we allow her to go back to her first husband, it looks like she divorced from her second husband. If she's going back to her first husband, it's an Isser Machzer Gushaso, it's an Isser Daraisa. That, we can't allow that to happen. That's why she's usher on her second husband. That's why she's usher on her first husband. People think the marriage to the second husband was legal, she was divorced from the first husband. So this concern only exists in a case where she could have legally married the second husband by somehow canceling the marriage to the first husband, such as with a get. Here in this case, though, what she did is she went and she married her Achos Ishto. She went and she married the second husband was her sister's husband. It's an Isser Achos Ishto. The only way that could have possibly made sense, a get would not allow her to do that marriage. The only way that could have made sense is if they thought, based on testimony, that the wife was dead, and if they thought the wife was dead, then they also thought the husband was dead. And therefore, there's no concern. People will realize there must have been mistaken testimony here. There's no problem of them thinking she was legally married to the second husband, and therefore she is legally allowed to go back to her first husband. That's all true in the case where she married That's all true in the case where it's clear that there was an Isser Achos Ishto here, and that Isser Achos Ishto couldn't be revoked. And that's the case where she's allowed to go back to her husband. The sister is allowed to go back to the brother-in-law. And that's where Rabbi Yossi was saying, because the sister is allowed to go back to the brother-in-law, the wife is allowed to go back to her husband. Now, there is a case, though, where you don't have this, where you don't have this heter. What's that case? That's where the husband and the wife were not married. They were only nisaris. They only had kedushin. In that case, Kedushin, there's such a thing as a Tanai. The Kedushin could be canceled because it was dependent on a certain condition and the condition wasn't fulfilled. So, says Rav Yitzchak Nafcha, what people will see, if there was only Kedushin between the husband and the wife, people will not assume that there was a mistaken testimony and that's why he married his wife's sister. They won't assume that. They'll assume that his marriage, his Kedushin to the wife was canceled. The Kedushin was canceled because it was based on the Tanai, and the Tanai it wasn't fulfilled. That's what people will assume. Therefore, people will not know, if it was just Kedushin, people will not know that there was a false testimony here, and therefore they're a shogeg, and it's not their fault. They will assume that the marriage of the original husband to his wife was canceled by a bad Tanai. If that's the case, and there was no mistaken testimony here when he went and married the sister, that's a legal marriage, and it must be that sister was divorced from the brother-in-law. Otherwise, how else could she legally marry the husband? If that's the case, then we have a problem. We cannot allow her to go back to her original husband, who's the man we're calling the brother-in-law, because people think she's married to a second husband now, and therefore she goes back to her first husband. She must have divorced him. She's a machzor gushaso. So that therefore our exer applies, and we cannot allow that. That's the two cases. That's the case where she is not allowed to go back to her husband, is where there was kedushin between the original husband and the wife. In the case where there was nesuin, you can't have an issue of tanai. There's no possible excuse of tanai. People will know that there must have been a aide who said false testimony and they made a mistake, and therefore there's no concern about people looking for machzor gushas over here. And Rabbi Yossi says the two halachos are dependent on each other. The Tanna Kama said they're not dependent. Doesn't matter if the sister-in-law is allowed to go back to her husband or not. The wife's allowed to go back to her husband. The Rabbi Yossi says no, they're dependent on each other. If the sister could go back to the brother-in-law, then the wife could go back to the husband. If the sister can't go back to the brother-in-law because it was only kedushin in the original marriage between the wife and the husband, then they are not allowed to go back to each other either. Okay, that's the reason Nafchas Pshat. The Gemara now brings the statement of Shmuel, who says the halacha is like Rabbi Yossi. The Gemara assumes that he means in this last approach of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha with all the details that Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha said. That is, that the reason that an Eshes Ish becomes usher on her husband if she married a second man is because, even if it was B'shogeg, is because we're afraid of what people will think that she was legally married to the second man, divorced from her first, and if she's going back to him as machzor gushaso. That concern does not apply if divorce wouldn't help, but it does apply even in a relationship where divorce wouldn't help, where it was kedushin and you could have had a cheshbon of tanai. Any situation, even based on tanai, where people will think that the marriage to the second husband is legal, she's usher to go back to her first husband, even if the marriage to the second was b'shogeg. The Gemara assumes this is what Shmuel's paskening. The Gemara says akasha, because we have a source that says that Shmuel doesn't hold of this tanai concern. Where do you see that? So the Gemara says a machogas between Shmuel and Rav with Rav Huna's explanation. Shmuel and Rav argue as to whether a Yevama counts as an Eshes Ish. Rav Huna explains the case is where a man does kedushin to a woman, then he goes off to Medinas Yam, a report comes back that he died, and she does yibam to his brother, and then of course he comes back, and now the question is what happens now. So Rav says, let's work it out. There's no possibility that they divorced. People won't think that they divorced because divorce would not matter in Eshes Ach. But there is a possibility of Tanai because it was just Kedushin. And therefore, people will think that the marriage to the first husband was broken. The brother who did Yibum wasn't really doing Yibum. He was just marrying her because there was no first marriage. It's a legal marriage. Even though the original brother is alive, it's a legal marriage. If she goes back to the original brother, it's Machzor Gushaso, and therefore it's just like an Eshes Ish, it's Aser. Shmuel says, Tanai is not a concern. People won't come up with Tanai. not called like an Eshes Ish. There's no possibility of people thinking she's legally married to the second brother. People will realize it must be false edus. She died, and that's it. She's allowed to go back to her first husband. So you see here, Shmuel doesn't hold of the Tanai Cheshbon. So I get Shmuel Paskin like Rabbi Yossi. So the Gemara says, why do you think when we say Shmuel Paskin like Rabbi Yossi, we mean according to Rabbi Yitzchak Nafcha's explanation? There's many different ways, many different things we could have meant over here. First of all, we could have not meant like Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka. We could have meant like Rabbi Ami's explanation, the first explanation that we gave in what Rabbi Yossi was trying to say, which has nothing to do with Tanai at all. Secondly, even if you want to say that we paskin like Rabbi Yitzchak Nafka, who says we're talking about both halves of what Rabbi Yossi said? Maybe we're talking about the half where he's not puzzle, that is where there's no issue, which is not based on the Tanai. That's where we're passing like Rabbi Yossi. The case where there is no Tanai possibility, not by Kedushin, where there's Nesuin, and there's no Tanai possibility, and therefore the woman's mutter, therefore the sister is mutter to the brother-in-law. I'm passing like Rabbi Yossi that in that case also the sister is mutter to the brother-in-law, and the wife is mutter to the husband. Or maybe we don't pass like Rav Huna. Maybe we have a different explanation as to what the machlokes between Rav and Shmuel over here was. Rav and Shmuel aren't arguing about this Tanai Cheshbon. Rav and Shmuel are arguing about the din of Rav Huna, which is Shomer's Yavam Shezinsa. If a woman who is waiting for Yibam is Mazana as Yevamos Daf, Rav Hamnuna said she's Aser on her husband. Maybe Rav and Shmuel are arguing whether she has a din of an Eshes Ish and she becomes Aser to her husband or not. Another thing, maybe they're arguing about Kedushin types in B'Yavama. We had a discussion earlier in this parak itself. Is there Tfisas Kedushin on a Yevamos Daf? Maybe Rav says she's like an Eshes Ish, and there's no Tfisas Kedushin. And Shmuel is saying she's not like an Eshes Ish, and there is a Tfisas Kedushin. Shmuel says, why could that be what they're talking about here? We already discussed that machlokes. Why would they say it again? Shmuel says that machlokes was derived from this one. It's two different Talmidim saying it over. One heard it directly, and one heard it based on something else, and it's being machadish.